Hello people, it is I, the Comics Kid 2099, here once again with a video where I explain some issues that I have with a comic book property. I've done this sort of thing before in a video where I talked about why I had trouble getting into Superman. In my Superman video, I talked about how DC Comics did a line-wide reboot for all of their comics in 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths. Some of DC's properties, like Batman, were reinvigorated, and you could argue that Batman became more popular in the 25 years that followed than he ever was before. Although this could also be attributed to the 1989 Tim Burton movie. But other comics, like Superman, seem to get tangled up in a big ball of, well, since we're rebooting everything, that one story that we're too mature to like now never actually happened in the brand new timeline. I think, in a way, the Legion of Superheroes got caught up in this as well. Originally, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, the stories with the Legion kept going as if there hadn't been a line-wide reboot. There had been a few things from the pre-Crisis reboot that had been done away with, like the existence of Supergirl and Superman's childhood adventures with the Legion, but for the most part, the Legion was mostly unaffected by the effects of Crisis. But then stories began to creep in to try to, air quotes, fix these mistakes. Before the Crisis, the origins of the Legion were tied to Superman fighting crime as a young boy. The Legion were influenced by Superboy to become a team of intergalactic crime fighters. And since, as per the new reboot, Superman was never Superboy, we had weird stories where the Time Trapper created, air quotes, pocket realities so that the Legion could still have a Superboy, even though Superman never was one. And this, like many stories that tried to fix weird problems created by Crisis on Infinite Earths, only made things more confusing. Then, in the late 1980s, the Legion of Superheroes timeline was moved forward 5 years. This era of the Legion is actually looked at very fondly across the internet, I've found. I've read a few of the early issues from this run, and I would most certainly read more if DC put out trade paperbacks of this era in the Legion. Hint, hint, DC. And although people really seem to hold this run of the Legion very highly, it did make one fatal mistake, to quote my favorite butler. You see, sometimes, in comics, a writer will make a big change in the status quo of a series to shake things up and to present fans with the illusion that things have changed so that they don't think they are reading a static comic book series. This is why Chris Claremont moved the X-Men to San Francisco in the 1980s, and then moved them to Australia later on. It was a brief change of pace, but it was one that wasn't permanent. Shortly before Claremont left the X-Men, the team was living back in New York City, just as they were 10 years earlier, with all of the big, air quotes, changes Claremont had made mostly undone. Most of the time, these changes are reversible, and they are just put in place in the first place to get as many stories out of this new status quo that the creative teams can. And then, once they've milked the new status quo dry, they make the change back. This is more or less happening with Spider-Man right now. In 2007, people probably thought that Spider-Man wouldn't be getting back together with Mary Jane Watson for a long time. It's now less than 7 years later, and while it's not exactly the same, Spider-Man is more or less back with MJ. So how does all of this apply to the Legion of Superheroes? No, I hadn't forgotten. Well, Keith Giffen moving the Legion timeline 5 years into the future was one of those rare changes that could not very easily be changed. You see, even though many people talk up the 5 years later run on the book as being one of the best, lots and lots of people feel like the Legion of Superheroes needs to be a group of kids. In the 1960s, part of the whole appeal of the series was that it was a bunch of teenagers who were buddies with each other, and they had a clubhouse and club rules. In that regard, it felt less like a superhero series and more of a science fiction-y update of books like The Babysitter's Club. Okay, I've never read The Babysitter's Club, but it seemed like an apt comparison. And when you take the characters who, before even Giffen got a hold of them, were already old enough to get married, some of them, and you age them 5 years instantly, many people are going to long for the days when the Legion were kids again. You know, take it back to the original concept. And there's just not many ways to do that. You could have 15-year-old Cosmic Boy sit up in his bed with a shout and say, "Oh, thank Grok, it was all a dream." But that is insulting to anybody who has invested time or money into however many years you are saying was a dream and isn't, air quotes, real. Well, as real as comic book stories can be, anyway. This is why the Spider-Man story One More Day didn't work so well. Joe Quesada seemed to think that Spider-Man was broken, and so he imposed his will on the creative team of Spider-Man and the fans who were reading Spider-Man. And him saying that Spider-Man just works better as a single dude living with his aunt is an implied slap in the face to anyone who read Spider-Man for the 20 years before One More Day and who liked Spider-Man as a married man who was a little bit more of a grown-up. So saying that the last several years of the Legion was all just a dream and insinuating that the fans and the creators were all just wasting their time was a big no. I guess you could have had the Time Trapper go back to the past for the Legion and do something fundamentally huge, creating an alternate timeline. And then, from that story on, you just follow the younger Legionnaires as they go through some of the same events, but they are now altered thanks to the Time Trapper's actions. You know, sort of like how the 2009 Star Trek movie did. And I guess this would have been better than flat out ignoring the previous stories in the dream scenario, but even this would still, in effect, be telling the fans of the Adult Legion that the Adult Legion is not as worthwhile as the Teenage Legion. So writer Keith Giffen introduced a group of clones who were teenagers, greatly resembling the team as they were from the 1960s. Now, I should go ahead and say that A, I'm not very familiar with this era of the Legion of Superheroes, and B, I don't actually know the reasons why Keith Giffen introduced the teenage clones of the Legion. But it seems to me that the reason was to try and, air quotes, undo the 5 years later jump in time so that everyone could have their cake and eat it too. If you prefer the younger Legionnaires as a more light-hearted team, you could just have that with a team that was, for a few short years, called the Legionnaires. And if you preferred the adult, more darker team, you could still have the non-clone Legion of Superheroes comic book. Now, I say all of that to say this. Sometimes, a story that an editor or a creator thinks would be really cool and lead to many more potentially awesome stories can sometimes do more damage than good for the franchise. And in the case of Legion of Superheroes, even if you're a lifelong fan of the franchise, you have to admit that at this point, things were pretty confusing. I cannot imagine being a neophyte fan of this franchise in the early 1990s. Trying to figure out why there is a teenage lightning lad and an adult character with the same name in another comic book. And clearly, someone else higher up in DC seemed to think that things had escalated beyond the point of repair. In 1994, there was another line-wide reboot. Well, sort of. 0 Hour, A Crisis in Time, I guess had the same goal as Crisis on Infinite Earths, but its effects were much less far-reaching, as it spawned just a couple of new titles, and really only heavily rebooted Hawkman and the Legion of Superheroes. Legion of Superheroes was basically completely scrapped and started from the ground up at this point. Now, once again, I should mention that I'm not especially familiar with much of the post-Zero Hour Legion of Superheroes, but the very idea that the Legion had gotten so complicated over the span of 15 years or a little longer, so that it apparently needed to be completely rebooted, is very telling of just why I have trouble getting into the Legion of Superheroes. It would be different if, from this point in time, the writers kept things simple and easy for fans to keep up with. But no, once you've hit a point where it becomes necessary to reboot, you're never going to go to a point where things are easy and simple. Comics are especially problematic because, since the 1960s, the people creating the comics are actually comic book fans who have grown up. Very rarely do you have someone who has not read comic books all of their life working in comics. That means that, for the most part, the people working on these comics feel invested in what has come before, and I'm not here to say that they should or shouldn't feel invested, but when you've just created a very simple way to escape a 15-year quagmire of confusion and headaches, the one thing you don't want to do is bring all of that back via creators who grew up with the pre-reboot version of this team. This is a problem that has plagued Superman since Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it also plagues the Legion. You have someone who is a child reading comics in the 1980s at the height of the 5 years later era, and then when they grow up and start writing comics, They want to call back to that era of Legion stories, even though that era no longer exists. This is why, after only 10 years, the Legion was once again reinvented in 2004. Waid's run is decent, at least in the first year, but the big problem is that apparently Waid felt the only way he could actually tell his stories was to wipe the board clean and reboot everything. Because by this point, that is just common practice with the Legion. If you're new on the book, why bother trying to figure out what stories you can and can't reference to make writing new stories easier? That will only give you headaches, so you might as well just start from the ground up. This version of the Legion didn't even last that long at all, as around 2007, Geoff Johns once again hit the reboot button. Johns is notorious for trying to restore things back to their Silver Age glory, as he had done with The Flash and Green Lantern. So he must have been rolling around in the living equivalent of a grave for decades, as the Legion had gotten away from the Silver Age-ness for a long, long time. And as near as I can tell, Johns' version of the Legion is basically the same thing as the original Legion of Superheroes. And I guess this is very simple and easy to understand for some people. But exactly how many people who were reading comics in the 1960s are reading comics now? Even if you say that Johns' Legion is also the 1980s Legion, when people reading in 2007 likely were reading comics, it's still not a perfect solution. Can you imagine being a neophyte fan of the Legion in 2007 up to the present day? Hi, I'd like to get into the Legion. Where do I start? Well... Then imagine a sense of dread as something greatly resembling the Nothing from The Never-Ending Story comes over this fan as they are told that roughly half of the Legion of Superhero stories don't actually, air quotes, count as part of the history of this team. I guess with the internet and things like Wikipedia to explain in even more agonizing detail everything I've talked about in this video, it might not be as bad as I'm making it out to be. But I think if someone did want to get into the Legion and they just found out everything I've talked about, they wouldn't stick around long. In fact, I'd be surprised if they stuck around comics for very long. And I should say, I've done quite a bit of hypothetical thinking for this video. Imagine that I'm a brand new comic book reader who knows nothing about the Legion, that sort of thing. But let me put all of this on myself in the here and now. I've been reading comic books for close to 12 years, and I would say I am moderately familiar with the Legion. There are entire decades of this franchise that I don't know very well, or stories that I don't know anything about. But if you showed me a picture of one of the Legion team members, I could probably tell you their code name and maybe their powers. But that's about it. Even with the 10 or so Legion of Superheroes books I own, it's hard for me to get very invested in this franchise because there is no consistency. I know that some fans like to get up in arms about continuity not being maintained, and other fans like to yell about those fans because they think that yelling about continuity means that I am complaining because Lightning Lad wore a cape in this panel and wasn't wearing one in the next panel. No, I don't actually care about that. I care about basic consistency. If Lightning Lad is married to Saturn Girl in the 1970s, then I don't want some writer who thought that that was a bad idea to come along and hit the Staples easy button just because they think they can do something better. This is never a fix because these writers are just playing tennis with their retcons and reboots. Oh, Geoff Johns restored the Legion to their Silver Age history, eh? Well, the game and point belongs to Andy Lanning, or Keith Giffen, or Mark Waid, or Jim Shooter, who will restore things to the way they liked it. None of these changes will ever stick, and the only person who actually loses is the fans. What makes this all the more maddening is that I don't see a solution to this. I would say, don't do reboots, as that seems to be where it all started. But it just seems like the best way to actually get into the Legion is to have a brain that is predisposed to knowing about all the different alternate teams and alternate histories and retcons and reboots and etc. And you basically just have to deal with it if you are not the kind of person who can keep up with all of that.